my pins, my whole system right now, it's a 70-pound compound, and I shoot a 660 grain all in arrow system, 25% FOC, but it's structurally sound. I got perfect flight, and then everything else falls in behind that. But my pin gap, when you compare it to a lighter setup, it's really not that far off from the difference in pin gap. When you compare them side, you can take them, put them side by side, and I can take a guy's with a 450 to 500 grain arrow system in mine, and they are very same poundage, same everything. The pin gaps are very close. You know, my wife uses a single pin with the tapes and everything, but it's really, I mean, that's a personal preference of single pin versus a multi-pin. And I use a multi-pin because I've used it my whole life. I'm used to seeing it, and I'm able to just go, okay, this animal click, it's 35 yards. There's my 30-yard pin, come up a little bit, split the gap between, put my, where 35 would be on its heart, or in the magic triangle to penetrate through that magic triangle, and then smooth release. So yeah, the interesting thing, and going back to what Troy did on his charts, and they're out there online, they're out on YouTube, you can find the charts. And I might have the numbers slightly off, but it was like a 380 something grain arrow, and then there was like a 500 grain arrow. The interesting thing on that chart, due to the speed erosion of that lighter arrow, the momentum of that arrow, that 380 something grain arrow at launch, was less than the 500 grain arrow was carrying at 60 yards.
Really?
Yes, and that's off of lab radar. All this was done off of lab radar. He and Daryl did this and plugged it out there. So it's quite an interesting, the resistance of the higher speed arrows, and the air, just the air alone, like Rob touched on, slowing that arrow down. And that hadn't even gotten to an animal at that point in time. So what do you have left? You're losing it quick. And I think that helps when people don't look at it in that detail, and they're thinking, okay, I've got to use this light, fast arrow. I've got to use the mechanical broadhead because it flies the same as my field point. That tells, and that's another topic, but that definitely helps increase the wound loss rates when you're using those super light, fast arrows. And then you've got the speed dump out at range, and they're wanting to launch these things at 50, 60, 70 yards. And I always tell these guys that, I mean, I've hunted out west, and I've got guys that are going out west. They're like, I need to go to this light fast setup because I've got to shoot 80, 90, 100 yards. I'm like, and this dives into something else. But I always tell those guys, my secret for your success at shooting at those distances is to learn how to bow hunt, get close. Archery is not about shooting at 80, 90, 100 yards. I mean, I practice at 80 yards. I have no problem shooting my 660 grain arrows at 80 yards at all. Yeah. And I practice that far. Do I want that to be my first shot? No. Will I make that shot if I make a bad shot at the animal reacts? I make a bad shot and he's standing out there. Yes, I can. So, but no, that would not be my first shot. Anyhow, but the mechanical side of things, when people tell me that, oh, I've got to shoot a mechanical because it flies the same as my field point, that tells me something between the arrow, the bow, or the Indian is not lined up. So then usually a lot of the times it's the Indian, but a lot of the times you've got a mismatched arrow to the bow, and they're not tuned. And I think a common misconception, a lot of these bow shops, they go to a bow shop, they get their bow, and they're like, oh, I'm good to go. The bow shop set it up for me, I'm ready to go. That's like going in and buying a rifle at Bass Pro Shops and they bore sighted it for you. Right. It's not ready to go. You got to take that bow. The individual bow hunters have to take that bow and fine tune it for that perfect flight, and not just rely. I couldn't tell you how many bows I have tuned for guys coming out of one shop here in Houston. It's ridiculous. I mean, the center shots are like half an inch off. They don't even know how to square it up. Cam lean, you name it. It's like, okay, let's get your bow square and then we'll go from there. And so yeah, that's it's for these guys to learn. The bow hunters need to learn how to take those squared up bows from the bow shop and then fine tune it to achieve perfect flight. And I screwed up on this last hunt. And thank God I know how to tune a bow, because when I flew up to Wyoming, I screwed up and I put my bow in the case with the resting on the outside of the case. Well, it got bashed by our, the baggage handlers. We know that they take things super light and nice and easy with all our bags, but it got bashed. And I went out to the range. I just kind of glanced at the bow. Yeah, everything looks right. When I launched my first arrow, I completely missed the target off to the left. I was like, what the hell was that? And I was like, was that me? And I shot another one, and it barely hit the target on the left. And then I looked down at my wrist, and it was shoved way off to the left side. And so I had to basically adjust back. And you talk about, I had a few hours of daylight, and I was hunting that evening, and then I was going out to hunt that next morning. So I had to basically adjust my center shot back to where it needed to be to get my flight corrected. And but I got it corrected. But tuning stuff like that, I mean, the bow hunters really need to learn how to take their bows and achieve that perfect flight. And we're talking about, going back to the heavier bows, heavier arrows, people wanting to go hunt in Africa with the heavier arrows. I've seen a lot of guys that they'll pick up their bow and they will not tune it. And I've seen some of these great arrow bills that they put out there. But then the arrow's flying sideways. It's just fishtailing, porpoising all over the place. And so it doesn't matter what arrow system you build. If you got poor flight, you're not going to penetrate.
Yeah. I was going to say an interesting thing I picked up on. You were saying guys need to learn how to square the bow up, tune it from there. I've also heard the opposite from somebody saying that basically you shouldn't worry about, and I'm paraphrasing, so I don't want to make it seem worse than it is, but basically you should buy your arrow, you should build your arrow, buy your arrow, tune the bow to the arrow with cam lean, with doing all the things to the bow to tune it. Whereas on the other side of things, where I've encountered with heavy arrows, it's kind of like, no, square the bow up and then tune you're going to find the arrow that works best for the squared up bow. So it's kind of coming at it from two different approaches. What do you guys say about the idea that you should just throw whatever arrow you want on the bow and then just mess with everything else on the bow to get it flying straight? Is there
you got to match the arrow to the bow. So like an arrow I use off my 70-pound bow is not going to be the same arrow that someone's going to use off of a 50-pound bow. So the spine, everything else. So it's not a one shoe fits all type system. And I look at it as three components to get that perfect flight: the arrow, the bow, and the Indian. I call it ABI, 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 the arrow, bow, Indian. Once I know the arrow's in the correct spine for the bow, and I was playing with I didn't realize it, but my son's bow, he cranked it from 60 to like 65 pounds. Well, he was right at that threshold of the spine he was using, and I had to take him to a different spine. So his arrow would fly perfectly off that bow. So it's not a one shoe fits all, and I'm gonna put in cam lean and just so they're getting perfect flight. That's the end of the game. That's the end game. Get perfect flight so you can maximize your penetration potential of that arrow system. Because if that arrow is not flying perfectly to that animal, and you hit that animal and it's fishtailing, you're losing penetration potential. So I don't really care how someone gets perfect flight, just so they get it.
Yeah, that's just one thing go ahead.
So to Rob's point, end game is perfect flight, right? To what you were mentioning, there's very much two different methods. And as Rob mentioned, you need to have have some of those details handled up front, that whatever weight you've got at the front of the shaft, it needs to be appropriate for the spine, for the bow. All of that's got to be kind of taken care of. But where a lot of the, what I'll call tuning to the arrow happens, is when there's other factors at play. Either there's a grip issue or the spine isn't correct. And so now you've got unnecessary flex happening that you're trying to cover.
Mm-hmm.
You can still achieve good flight if you really shift things around, because like a compound is intended to launch straight, right? The more that we improve these bows, we're minimizing knock travel. Everything is center shot. It's traveling as straight of a line as possible with as little variation. We're using, mechanical releases. All of that is eliminating string movement, is eliminating all of those variables that used to exist in older bows and in traditional bows.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that less and less flex is needed for a clean launch and clean flight. And so I'll say textbook way is that if your spine is good, if your form is good, you should be able to square the bow up, put it to center, have the cams set so that it is pushing center, and everything should fly perfect. And then you can put whatever arrow you want in there that is appropriate, and it's going to fly. That's what I do, right? So I'll have an arrow that I'll shoot for 3D. I'll have an arrow that I shoot for hunting. And I intentionally tune my bows with an extremely stiff shaft, because if I have any misalignments, that stiff shaft, I've got no flex to hide it.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to kick. And I shoot bare shaft for tuning. And so that stiff shaft is going to create pressure and kick off, and I'm going to see it and I'll be able to fine tune. And now when I put my actual arrow in there and level it out, now everything is good, right?
Yeah.
Now, the flip side of that is if there are some other issues, you're essentially going back in time. And this isn't saying that it's wrong. It's not the most efficient, but it's not wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Clean flight is the goal. And so, like, if you've got poor grip that's causing some hand torque, if you've got cam lean or whatever, or your shaft is flexing more than it should be, you can move things and essentially counterbalance.
Mm-hmm.
Where you've got this happening, and if I change this, well, that's going to counteract what was happening, and now it's going to balance out. But that's essentially going back to offset risers and shooting with fingers.
Yeah.
Because you're changing the string movement, and you're going off center, and now you're getting very spine and shaft dependent. Because if that flex changes, now it doesn't fly the same.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so that's where, like, I have the flexibility of going, I'm going to switch shafts. I'm going to go play with this. I might need, I'm going to fine tune, but I'm not going to be making any drastic changes. Where if you're set up for the arrow, you change systems, you're going to be at square one.
Right.
Because now your flex is different. And that's where, like, shooting my traditional bows, my longbow doesn't have a shelf. It has a post. And so my arrow is off to the side of the riser. In order for me to have clean flight, it has to flex the perfect amount to not press on the riser and then come back and go straight where I'm looking. If that flex is off, it's not going where I want. And that's what happens in that scenario, is that you're essentially inducing that paradox where the arrow's pointing one way, but it's going to flex and correct and go the way that you're looking.
Yeah.
And it's not that it's wrong. It's just not as efficient.
Yeah. And I guess my point with the question was kind of to really emphasize the importance of like paying attention to the arrows that you're buying, in terms of a lot of times guys want to just go to whatever store, grab a pack off the shelf, and they just grab the 340 spine or the 400 spine, throw the 100 grain on front, and then just take to the shop and have them do all this stuff to their bow, where it seems like it seems to me it would be easier to build the arrow correctly, like you're taking in all the factors, and then just squaring up your bow so that, like you were saying, when it comes to off season, I want to shoot 3D, I'm not having to tweak everything back around to a different arrow.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it wasn't necessarily me saying is there a right or wrong way, but just a, I guess, more efficient way to do it. You know, because,
well, and like if talking about efficiency, one, there's your time, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's an efficiency factor of being able to just go out and go do what you want to do. But from a bow efficiency standpoint, the less that the shaft flexes, the less energy you're wasting in that flex, the faster that it recovers. While it's flexing, that's your highest drag portion of the launch.
Right.
And so as that's flexing and your vanes and stuff are deviating from in line, you're creating excessive drag, which is then allowing it to correct itself. All of that is reducing your speed at a faster rate.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want the most efficient, cleanest launch possible, you're trying to minimize all of that.
Yeah.
Did you want to talk at all on the trajectory aspect? I know that you mentioned that earlier.
Yeah.
I mean, trajectory. Yeah. I mean, it's a personal preference. It plain and simple is a personal preference. Like the hunt I was just on, there was a gentleman there more from the target audience, target side of the world. Had been trained by numerous top professionals, great archers, Olympic archers, everything. And, I was talking to him and he was like, well, and one of the young guides there was asking him, he's like, well, he asked him, he said, what should I look at in my arrow systems that I just bought a bow and everything. And this gentleman told him, and he said, accuracy. I was like, well, that's a given. That's a given.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so that's an automatic given. Everybody strives for that perfect shot, but not everybody is a super Olympic archer and can make that perfect shot. So, I mean, but yeah, right. we're all different. Some people have ability to stack those dots at 100 yards, but like I said earlier, that animal has a vote in that, what it does. Here's an arrow released it from 100 yards away or 80 yards away. Good chance that animal's going to be not at that same location by the time that arrow gets there. That happens at 20 yards too.
Right.
But jumping into the trajectory deal, a lot of people were like, well, and even this gentleman told me, he said, I like my setup where if I range an animal and it's at 35 yards and it takes 2 steps, I don't want to have to rearrange, find it, readjust to do something. I just want to be able to put my 35-yard pin on it and let it fly.
Mm-hmm.
And inside of 40 yards, and I've run the test. I mean, I've run these side by side. Granted, both bows were set up, but my heavier arrow system than a common system, and the trajectory out to 40 yards is really not that big of a difference. It is a little bit different, but not noticeable. Maybe to some Olympic target shooter all the time, it might be noticeable to them. But surprising, and I think that's a misconception that this arrow is just going to throw it off in the dirt. No, I mean, I've got higher forward to center. I've got a full 12-factor arrow system here. So really my trajectory out to say 40 yards. After 40 yards, yes, the trajectory starts to be a difference. But I'm used to that trajectory, whereas someone else might not be used to that trajectory. And we always state, use the heaviest arrow with a trajectory that you find acceptable. We don't say you've got to use this weight, this type of arrow system or anything like that. And so yeah, it honestly, the trajectory is just a plain and simple personal preference.
And that acceptable is very much an experience thing.
Yeah.
Because if you're used to shooting 330, 340 feet per second, it's going to be a change, right? Where if you're someone coming out of an old bow that you've been hunting at 250 for years, you come into a new bow, you can load that thing up and get to the same kind of speed that you were at before. And there's really not much of a difference there, right?
Right.
But a piece that I always like to talk on trajectory, and especially the confidence aspect when it comes to exactly what Rob just mentioned, is so you range an animal and it moves. You're already at full draw, it moves. So tying back to the speed loss that we talked about earlier, that drastically impacts your gaps. So if you think about, like, I guess if I think about like a couple years ago, I was shooting competitive for 3D locally. And I was running a very light arrow for that, but all of that is inside of, like 40 yards. Now, as you start stretching out, and even like depending on the bow, even out to 40 yards, those super light arrows are launching fast. And so it's fairly flat at the, like, say 20 to 30. And then, but those gaps, every step gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so if you're trying to adjust for an animal that moved, that can start getting complicated. Because now not only do I need to think about, okay, how far do I think the animal moved, but I also need to think about where's my pin at and how big is that gap to the next step. Right. So my hunting setup is, I guess, like my 60-pound bow that I use for most of my local whitetail type stuff is like a 620 grain arrow. My 80-pound bow is a 950 grain arrow. Both of them, I have a Spot Hog Fast Eddie double pin, and then I have a triple stack. So fixed vertical pins.
Yep.
So I have fixed gapping there, right? I guess the triple stack is adjustable, but once it's set, it's locked in at those gaps. The beautiful thing is, because of the lack of speed loss, I don't have a huge change in my gaps. Yeah. So like that 950 setup, I can, yeah. So that's that 660 grain.
That's a 660 right there.
Look at how consistent the gaps are.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is a piece that I always try and tie in, is like super light guys, it's like super tight and then it's bigger. Yeah. Where the difference with if you start going heavy, you start getting 10 grains per pound or higher, is your 20 to 30 is going to be bigger, right? It's not going to be super stacked. But now I'm always thinking hunting situation. And so now I go, okay, I range an animal and it moves. I don't need to question what pin I'm using or where I'm at in that range and how big the gap is. I know, like my double pin, it's between 20 yards and 100 yards. It's a 9 to 11 yard gap between those pins. So I can just assume 10 yards.
Yeah.
Anywhere I can have that at 54 yards, I could have it at 20 yards. I know that it's about a 10-yard gap between those two pins. And I can then make a very quick estimate of the animal probably moved 3 yards. I'm going to hold this high or this low. That, for me, that's very confidence inspiring.
Right. Right.
I don't need to question it. I'm not concerned if that animal moves because I know the gaps.
Yeah.
And I don't have to question it. It's just, it is what it is. And that's the same thing with like my 60-pound bow is I have very similar gapping on that bow. And it's not like these are flying that slow. Both of those setups, the 60-pound and the 80-pound bow with their respective arrows, are shooting in the like 230 to 240 range.
Yeah.
Like I shoot tack with both those builds.
Yeah.
I've ran, and it's hilarious when you do it, but I've ran that 950 build at Total Archery Challenge, shooting targets at 100+ yards.
Yeah.
And people are like, why is that bow so quiet? I'm like, oh, here's an arrow. And
yeah.
like, oh. right?
Right.
And like, is it the perfect setup for that? No, but it's a great conversation starter.
Oh yeah.
And it's proving the fact that like people think that you start getting heavy and it's like, oh man, if I shoot a 500 grain arrow, I'm not going to be able to hunt at 40 yards. I'm not going to be able to hunt at 50 yards.
Yeah.
No, like my wife is shooting 50 pounds and she's running like 525 for like most stuff for whitetail. And if she goes somewhere else with me, then I've got her set up where she's spined for a 200 grain head up front with, she's got a 200 grain component. And so for like whitetail, she's running a 125 and she's at like 525.
Yeah.
Well, if we go after something big, she can slap a 200 grain broadhead on there. It's spined appropriately for that 200. And now she's about 600.
Yeah.
And she can still hunt to 35, 40 yards comfortably. Like she's not comfortable shooting past that regardless of her speed.
Right.
So what's the downfall?
Yeah. And I think a lot of people hear heavy arrow when we're talking trajectory. Yeah, I feel like a lot of people think that when you get out past 20 yards with a heavy arrow, all of a sudden you're like shooting
Just
in a rainbow. Yeah, like you have to like shoot, up into the sky, and it's
right.
That's one of the like misconceptions. And yeah, I shot tack this year with a 585 grain arrow, and I hit every target. I shot the knock on course, and then I shot the Sasquatch at 100 and I think it was like 106.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, anyone I've told like, oh, I shoot my hunting arrow this year is 585, and everyone's like, oh, that's heavy, and it's like, yeah, but it's not. I mean, when you see someone, like you said, when you put it in practice and they see it, no one is gonna look at you shoot that arrow and go, oh man, that's a super heavy arrow, unless you tell them, right? But
they're not even gonna question it.
Yeah, and but to your point, I have had people go, man, your bow's quiet. It's like, yes, and it feels much more dead in my hands when you shoot it. Like you said, all of that energy is able to transfer more so into the arrow than to just be like to your hand after you shoot it, and that's where I guess that's kind of a good place to bring it back. I guess that's where we talk about the happy medium, that my arrow's not a 12 factor arrow. To be honest with you, I don't know how many factors it would cover. I would guess about half or a little more, but like I'm still receiving a ton of benefit from that. And it's not like 585 grains is some extreme crazy heavy number either.
No.
But I can tell you I have a hell of a lot more confidence in that arrow than I would a lighter setup. But
and that's key, right? That is the critical piece. Is archery is so mental.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're at full draw and you're aiming at an animal, your focus needs to be that point of impact, right? The minute that you start worrying, the minute that you start questioning and going, oh, like don't hit the shoulder, don't do this, don't do this.
Yeah.
Guess what? You're not focusing on the shot, and you're that much more likely to have those things happen.
Yeah.
And so if you're confident in your build, and this for me personally ties back to the accuracy piece, my most accurate state is when I am 100% confident in my equipment.
Yeah.
Where I know that if something went wrong, I'm confident that my system is still going to perform lethally.
Right.
Right. It might not be a pass through, but I am confident that it's going to be lethal.
Right.
And that allows me to not question. And that means that I'm focused on my shot. And guess what? Then I make a better shot.
Yeah.
And that ties to like your happy medium thing, right? Is if you look at the 12 factors, it is not a like rule book of you must do this and you must do this and here's this requirement. It's a guide. It's a tool for bow hunters to evaluate their system regardless of where it's at and have an understanding of what that means for their potential performance, right? And so if you're on the low end of some of those scales, like regardless of whether, and like people say, oh, I don't believe in the 12 factors. Well, it's not a belief. It's data driven guidelines.
Right.
And so you're somewhere on that scale. If you're on the light end, okay. If low mechanical advantage, okay. On and on. But that gives you an evaluation. You can look at your system and go, this is where I'm at on those scales. Now, if I'm going to proceed with that, then I need to act accordingly. I should recognize that it's not going to be the best on bone. I need to take my shots accordingly. Right. Maybe I don't take that quartering 2 shot. Maybe I wait for quartering aways or that animal's a little too fidgety. It's probably going to react more than I want. It's not probably a smart shot for me. And that's where you look at the guys that, like you mentioned, you'll have guys that have hunted for years that haven't had a problem. And that's great. But if you dive into that, they're guys that have the time. They're guys that have the patience, that are only taking very smart, very safe shots.
Yeah.
And the further you get away from that, and this is sadly, the majority of bow hunters are weekenders.
Yeah.
Right. They don't have the time to go, hey, I'm going to spend 50 days in the woods this fall and I'm going to wait for that perfect opportunity.
Right.
I'm going to pass and way too many of us are limited in time and we go, I don't want to miss this opportunity.
Yeah. Send it.
I want to make it happen. Right. And so now that needs to play into how you prep.
Right.
And so then you start looking at, if that's what I'm considering, I should probably be prepared for some other situations.
Yeah.
And now you can start going, hey, I saw this. Using the factors, you can go, okay, if I change the broadhead, that's going to affect this, and this. And that'll be an improvement.
Right.
Now I'm here on the scale. If I add some weight, well, now I've got more inertia. Now I've got more momentum. That affects these. And now I'm here on the scale. If I start doing these things in combination, well, now I'm here.
Right.
So it's not like we have our recommendations and we have to try and grade it somehow. And so like even on like the weight scale, the weight graph that we have everything from an A+ to Fs. Right. But it's one piece. And it's not that like you can fail a class and you can still graduate. It's not the end all be all. It's where are you at, understand it, and proceed accordingly.
Yeah.
And if you see a problem, hey, you've got a guideline.
Right.
Make some adjustments.
Right.
But that's where like the best thing that I can say for people that are like concerned about the trajectory, concerned about what it's going to do to how they hunt, try it.
Mm-hmm.
Do a test pack. A bunch of companies now are offering test packs where you don't have to go drop a couple $100 on a dozen arrows. You can buy a 2-pack.
Right.
You can buy a single. And now you buy that one arrow, you spend $15 on a bunch of different weight field points, and you go, okay, let's try 500.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that wasn't as bad as I thought. Well, let's try 5 1/4, and then 550, and then 575. Oh, and then now my gaps are getting here, and okay, drop back to 550. Okay, so now how do you maximize that 550?
Mm-hmm.
Now let's get the right spine. Let's get the weight up front. Let's get it flying perfect. Let's get all those pieces, put an efficient broadhead up front. And now, like a handful of people on our board, you've got a mid 500 build that is maximized.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Yeah.
You're good.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a perfect way to bring it home, because it ends on the final thought of like, the Ashby Bowhunting Foundation isn't saying shoot 800 grains or 650 or else. You guys are like you said, the 12 factors are guidelines to maximize where you're comfortable with shooting, and I think that goes a long way, because like I said, a lot of people want to go to the extremes, but if, like you're saying, if you get it up and you're testing and you get to 550 and you're like, that checks off your list, and then you can use those guidelines to make it the most lethal 550 that it can be. I think that's ultimately what you guys are getting after. Not
Correct.
some like dogma or, it's got to be this way. It's, hey man, we want to make you the most efficient, deadly bow hunter in the woods. And at the same time, yeah, we recognize that a heavier arrow is going to be more lethal for all of these number of reasons, but ultimately it's getting you confident in your setup and creating the most efficient setup that you're confident with, so that when those animals come out, you can perform and get the job done.
Yeah. And that's where, like I said before, I always try and use heavier than heavy, right? Because then there isn't a line to cross.
Right. Yeah.
There isn't some magical number.
Yeah.
Because if you go from 350 to 400, it's not where I personally would want you to be, but it's better.
It's better. Right. Yeah.
And that's our goal, is improvement.
Right.
Yeah.
If we want to reduce the wounded loss rate, we don't need to get to some magical number. We need to improve as an archery community.
Right.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, and people talk about, you mentioned on it earlier, Vincent, about there's an argument between light and heavy. I don't really ever have these arguments. Nobody ever calls me and wants to argue with us.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, because I'm going to be the same thing like you mentioned earlier. It's like, okay, well, let's look at the data and see where all this takes us. And so it's really not even an argument to me. It's like, okay, the bow hunting community needs to look at it as a whole and improve the image of bow hunting across the spectrum, because we see how emotional our society has become from one extreme to another. And if we don't take care of it ourselves and address it and educate people, and they start, you say you have the wrong situation happen in front of the right person, and that emotional mess happens, and it basically, it's a public perception, and and the non-hunting public votes. Right. So I mean, things that can go wrong have gone wrong. We've already seen it among bow hunters, and but bow hunters really need to evaluate everything and be as lethal as possible. Right. Right. If you're going to do it right. Right.
Yeah, and I don't know how anybody could disagree with that. You know.
So,
But yeah, hey guys, I appreciate all your time. I really, like I said, I know I went off on a lot of different tangents, but it's a lot of questions that, you know, either I've had a conversation with somebody about, or I've thought of myself, and I appreciate you guys taking the time to just listen to every single thing I I can come up with.
oh yeah, enjoy
Let
it.
everybody know, where can they find the Ashby Bowhunting Foundation, where can they find the 12 factors and everything that we've been talking about today, if they want to dive in a little bit deeper with their arrow systems.
Yeah, it's just ashbybowhunting.org is where you can find us online. You can go under, we've got all the reports going back 40 years, including the 2021 case studies out there. I'm working on the 2022 case study, and hopefully by the end of this month, I'm keeping my fingers crossed that I can get through that. It was the 2022 was more voluminous. We ran twice as many arrowheads in this case study that we did last year. So, awesome. But and we're going to make some improvements to that based off of last year. And again, we're not perfect. Okay, we did last year's case study, and now we're okay. Here are some suggestions that came in, and yeah, that'll help improve our message as well. So,
but I mean, you can find us on Instagram, Ashby Bowhunting, Facebook, LinkedIn. We're on most of the social media platforms. And then the website, ashbybowhuntingfoundation.org.
No, it's ashbybowhunting.org.
Or ashbybowhunting.org. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I always do that. But I guess, yeah, if you like what we've been talking about, you like the direction that we're trying to push and trying to improve the industry. As we mentioned earlier, we are nonprofit. We are fully funded by individuals supporting our passion and our vision. And so we do have some merch. We've got even some signed stuff from Doc if you want to have some collector type items, or you can just do a donation. We have subscriptions that you can do like a weekly or monthly small donation and help us continue doing this work. So
and any donations go straight to testing. There's no salaries, no nothing
exactly
paid by the foundation. So everybody that does this stuff for the foundation, we're all volunteers.
Awesome. Yeah, that's always a good thing to know, that, you know, you guys aren't being irresponsible with money. You're not making money off this. You're simply doing it for your love of archery or, you know, hunting, and trying to get information into everybody's hands to make them the most lethal that they can. And I think what you guys are doing is absolutely awesome. And hey, even if you guys don't totally agree, maybe for some reason you're still not sure about heavier arrows, whatever, do the due diligence on your side. Check them out. You know, read what they're doing. Regardless of where you fall on the span of arrow weights, like, that's not all that this is about. And I think it's a great thing for a lot of people to look into. So go to the website, go follow them on social media. And yeah, guys, hey, I appreciate all your time. And I couldn't be more thankful for you guys spending these couple hours with me. Hopefully we can get this information out to a lot of good people, and we can make bow hunting more lethal. And yeah.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
And I appreciate you having us on here.
Absolutely.
Great time. Great visit. Yeah, if any of your listeners have any questions, have them reach out directly to us. Glad
I was going to say, I'm sure after this, there's going to be a lot of questions that I am just not qualified to field. But
we have a couple of different contact methods. We've got a Ask Ashby, or just for general questions, there's a contact us on the website. Mm-hmm. I try and monitor those as much as I can daily.
Yeah.
And answer whatever questions come in.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, guys. Hope you guys have a great afternoon, great weekend, and it seems like all the seasons are starting to kick off. So you guys, good luck the rest of the season. Can't wait to see what you guys put down, and we'll talk with you guys later.
All right, sounds great.
Thanks, guys.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
All right, guys. So that gives us a ton of data to think about, and I hope you guys enjoyed that episode. If you did, if you like where this podcast is going, make sure you take a second and you're subscribing to the show wherever you're listening to podcasts. I don't want you to miss any of the information we got coming out. We're going to try to get someone else who is a little more of an advocate for a lighter arrow. But as I said before, and after this episode, I think we can all agree that there is kind of a happy medium to be found, and it's not quite as heavy or light as I think everyone thinks it is. If you are liking this show, like I said, please make sure you're subscribing. If you would, take a second and rate and review the podcast. The only reason I want you to do that is I want this information to get out in front of as many people as we can get it in front of. And rating and reviewing is the best way to do that. It only takes just a second. It's simple and easy to do. And it's going to help me to continue to get great guests on the show so that you guys can continue learning and making yourself more lethal in the woods. So we're going to catch up with you guys next week. This is the Antler and Feather Co. podcast. You are listening to the Antler and Feather Co. podcast.